let's talk about Indigenous youth suicide prevention. Did you know that in Canada, Indigenous youth are 5 to 7 times more likely to commit suicide than non-Indigenous youth? What makes the statistic even scarier is that Indigenous youth only make up 5.9% of the overall 19.2% of Canadian youth population. You may be wondering why you should care about a specified issue such as this one. The answer is simple. Indigenous issues are Canada's issues. Whether it be through European settlers or the Canadian government's residential school system, Indigenous people have been suffering for years. These institutions both stripped Indigenous people of their identities and forced them to assimilate into the widely accepted Western culture. As a result, Indigenous youth have been experiencing social and cultural disconnect from situations that took place decades and centuries ago, 2 factors that are said to contribute to incidences of suicide among Indigenous communities. Current suicide prevention programs have not been effective in Indigenous communities, and so far as the suicide rate has remained the same. One must ask why this is. With its centralized focus on mental health professionals and westernized methods of treatment and prevention, current prevention programs have become yet another system of oppression against Indigenous people, specifically targeting their beliefs surrounding health and methodology. As a result, Indigenous health has been continuously ignored within health research. Suicide among Indigenous communities is contextually different than it is elsewhere, and prevention approaches must recognize this. However, with this recognition comes a culture as treatment approach, which comes with 3 main recommendations. The first being a greater need for Indigenous representation in suicide prevention programs. As mentioned, suicide is different for Indigenous communities, and it is also a new phenomenon in these communities. The Canadian government doesn't have the capacity alone to implement an adequate prevention program that adheres to the needs of Indigenous peoples. It would be counterintuitive and therefore improper for anyone but an Indigenous community representative to develop a health program suited for Indigenous people. The next recommendation is for Indigenous culture to be implemented in the school curriculum and showcased in community centers through, for example, art, music, storytelling, etc. For each institution, the content of Indigenous culture would be catered to explore the culture of the Indigenous community that is native to the area of said schools or centers. This is a way for Indigenous people to both reclaim their culture and share it with the rest of Canada in order to create a sense of belonging for Indigenous youth that was stolen from them before they even got a chance. The final recommendation is for Indigenous health data to be included in overall Canadian health research. As of a few years ago, the Canadian federal government had no idea how many Indigenous people had died from suicide in any given year. It seems redundant to ask for representation of Indigenous health data in Canadian health research. However, they're often misrepresented or not considered at all. By organizing Indigenous health information, Indigenous communities and the rest of Canada are better to adapt to address health concerns in Indigenous populations. Combined, the recommendations allow Indigenous communities to reclaim their culture, which has been cited as a promising solution to decrease the number of suicide among Indigenous youth. For example, in the Inuit community in Nunavut, a local youth committee opened up a community center that allowed Inuit adolescents the opportunity to see peer counselors, speak with elders, and engage in other fun activities. As a result, suicide stopped for nearly 2 years, only rising again due to the center closing because of financial insecurities. However, it's important to remark that this particular community once had the highest rate of suicide in the world. Although there lacks research regarding other relevant examples that prove the effectiveness of culture as treatment, it's clear from this case that even the smallest amount of Indigenous culture can create a positive impact for Indigenous youth. It's time for Canada as a nation to recognize that Indigenous suicide is not the cause of personal agency, but rather it's a product of cultural, community, and historical oppression. Only then can Indigenous suicide prevention be properly addressed. Canada, it's time that we act now.